Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
We have a big 3-2 pitch coming here from Eckersley. Gibson swings and a fly ball to deep right field. This is going to be a home run. Unbelievable! A home run for Gibson. And the Dodgers have won the game 5-4. I don't believe what I just saw. I don't believe what I just saw.
My guest today is author, reporter, and political analyst Curt Smith. His love for reading, writing, history, and baseball led him to becoming a leading authority on America's game and politics. Smith is the author of 18 books, including the highly praised Voices of the Game, which was adapted for ESPN TV. He also wrote The Presidents and the Pastime, which was honored by the White House Historical Association and called by the Christian Science Monitor a rich vein of anecdotal material. His most recent work is Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting, an official book of the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and the first to describe the first 100 years of baseball radio and TV. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of Memories from the Microphone, 2018 Ford C. Frick Award winner Bob Costas said, Curt Smith's knowledge of the history of baseball broadcasting and its foremost practitioners is unsurpassed. And we are very pleased to have the decorated analyst and baseball writer with us today. Welcome, Curt.
Rob, thank you very much. Terrific to be with you.
Before we get into the history, we all have these announcers. If you're a true baseball fan, and I love baseball, I consider myself a baseball fan, I had announcers I grew up with. You must have as well. So who were those early announcers that you grew up listening to?
Well, I was very fortunate. I grew up in upstate New York, a little bit south of Rochester, in a small town of about 2,000 people, what I call Mayberry without the accent. And yes, I did indeed have several favorites. We were in New York Yankees terrain, even though I'm a Red Sox fan. And I listened to Red Barber and Mel Allen, the great artists of the mid-20th century. Barber was white wine, grape Suzette, and bluegrass music. Allen was beer, Valentine naturally, since it was the Yankees sponsor. He was Hot Dogs of the United States Marine Band. And they were network baseball all during the mid-century. But on Saturday and Sunday, my real religion began, and that is the CBS television game of the week, hosted by the inimitable, incomparable J. Hannah Dizzy Dean. Dizzy Dean was my introduction to baseball. Now, if you couldn't fall in love with the pastime given that sort of debut, you really had a problem. Dean often said of his atrocious grammar, they got to be my words because no one else would have them. And you could literally tell, this is no exaggeration, Rob, from the lack of traffic in our small town, uptown, on a Saturday and Sunday afternoon, that Dizzy Dean was on the air. I mean, the old adage of business is closed down, in this case, was literally true.
Curt, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Batting 1000 Red Lager from the Beltway Brewing Company of Sterling, Virginia. Batting 1000 is a baseball beer that starts with a core of Irish-style red lager and finishes as a clean, crisp, malt-forward beer. And it's a brew that would make the best hitters of all time proud. So whether you are Ruth, Gehrig, Williams, Aaron, Mantle, Musial, or Mays, this Irish red lager is a hit every single time. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get those newest episodes right away. And to the growing list of listeners from more than 70 countries and 2,000 cities from around the globe, I have to say thank you. And now, I raise my batting 1,000 red lager very high. And to all of those who brought America's great game to the fans in good times and in bad, for all of the memories, I have to say, cheers. Let's take it back to the very first broadcast, which of course is covered in your book. If we go back to the very first radio broadcast, it happened on election night, 1920, Harding and Cox, and that was KDKA in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
That same station, just a few months later, which is just amazing to me to think of, that within a few months of the first broadcast, you have a baseball game that's going to get broadcast. How did they make that happen?
Well, it's interesting. KDKA in Pittsburgh today, and for many decades, has been 50,000 watts. So you can literally hear it in half the country. That was demonstrably not true on August 5 of 1921. KDKA, as you suggest, was only about 7 or 8 months old. And it had the great volume, the great power of 100 watts. So we're not sure how many people heard it in the Pittsburgh area. My measured guess is not many. So Harold Arlen was born in Illinois, incidentally, and educated in Kansas and then came east, was a Westinghouse company foreman. Westinghouse then owned KDKA, as it did for many, many decades. Perhaps still does, in fact. So KDKA was looking for programming, and this August afternoon it sent Harold Arlen, a Westinghouse company foreman, out to Forbes Field to broadcast the baseball game. Well, he went with rather Spartan equipment. He sat in the box seat, bought it, behind the screen, behind home plate. He used a plank of wood on which to put the scoreboard. He used the telephone as a microphone, and he talked to the station. He didn't know what he was doing, as he freely admitted after the fact. Why would he? There was no model to follow. So, as I understand it, at least, he described the pitch. There's a pitch and it's outside, ball one. And then 15 to 20 seconds later, and there's another pitch. It was right down the plate, strike one. He didn't know that there was a need for him to tell anecdote and story and aside and perhaps supply some humor. But no one cared if, in fact, you did hear the game in 1921, because just think of the sheer wonder of it. Sound, the sounds of baseball coming through the air. It must have been an extraterrestrial experience for many of the people there.
This is KDKA of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We shall now broadcast the election returns. We are receiving these returns through the cooperation and by special arrangements with the Pittsburgh Post and Sun. We'd appreciate it if anyone hearing this broadcast would communicate with us, as we are very anxious to know how far the broadcast is reaching and how it is being received.
How does KDKA move forward from that first game? I'm just wondering, when does broadcasting baseball move from being an isolated event to something more routine and even expected?
Well, they were looking for programming, as I said, and Harold Arlen also did a variety show when he interviewed, for example, Marshall Falk, the former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. He interviewed Herbert Hoover, and baseball to him was almost an aside. But he did do games sporadically through 1925. KDKA was the first, and for many clubs it was the only, because clubs didn't begin to broadcast really in earnest on a daily basis until the 1930s. So he had the province to himself, and the Times of London called him, a direct quote, the world's most famous radio announcer.
One of the most famous announcers in the 20s and the 30s, since we're back in that time period, was Graham McNamee.
Right.
He has a fascinating story. He doesn't know very much about the game. His history is as an opera singer.
Yes, he was. He had a wonderful voice, a deep baritone, which, of course, fills most of the register on radio, the objective of any announcer. He debuts in 1923 As I said, he's a former opera singer. In fact, he was still singing at many concert halls around the country at that time. But he gets an interview, and he passes the interview, and he's hired by a New York radio station in 1923. Before then, actually, he had done the World Series in the previous year. But in 23, he takes play-by-play from the famed writer Grantland Rice, who was much better and more eloquent on pen than behind the microphone. That was not true of McNamee. He was an instant success, a sensation, in fact. And from 1923 through 34, he does the World Series every year. The All-Star Game begins in 1933, and he does that as well. And he was a subject of great controversy, not to the average fan, who really didn't care that McNamee knew little of the game and didn't talk about anything beyond, well, there's a ground ball to shortstop, he throws to first, and the batter is out. And then McNamee would broach into telling a story or a humorous aside. But the bone of contention was with reporters. Keep in mind, until 1921, if you wanted to follow baseball, you were restricted solely to the printed page, whether it be a book or a magazine or a serial. And now in 1923, 24, all the way through the 30s, McNamee is the king. That was his nickname, the king, a regal title indeed. So there's a reporter who was once listening to McNamee and knowing that Graham knew very little about baseball, as he himself off-air said. So the reporter says he's right there. He sees McNamee describe the game, and he also sees the game in front of him. So the reporter says, I don't know what game to write about, the game I saw today or the game I heard Graham McNamee call. But a lot of that was sheer envy. McNamee was enormously well-known, and they were not.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Graham McNamee speaking from Navin Field in Detroit, Michigan. We're here this afternoon to witness the opening of the great annual baseball classic, the World Series.
If you take the history of baseball, and it had been in written form through newspapers and I guess even books at that time, what did those early reporters, I mean, you know that McNamee is targeted,
right?
But was the medium itself targeted? Did they look at radio as an abomination?
Well, it's not simply an abomination, but a mortal threat to them and to their occupation. They understood that every year radio increased in terms of exposure to the average person. For example, in 1923, 3 million American homes owned a radio. In 1933, 33 million did. So Americans were buying literally tens of thousands of radios a day, at least in some years. So they looked at McNamee and they said, what a fraud this guy is. That made them burn. But the fact that he was enormously popular and, frankly, making a lot more money than they did truly made him an object, at least in their eyes, of contempt. Not, however, the average listener. They couldn't get enough.
Those early games, many of them were local games. They could cover the local game live. But then when they went on the road, it was a real challenge.
Yeah.
So they started to reenact games, and that become an art into and of itself.
Well, it did. The recreation was precisely that. It was an art form. It was an event in progress, if you would, because they too were making it up, just like Harold Arlen in 1921. Recreation, which is exactly what it sounds like, you're reinventing the game after the fact. They arose because of finances. It was too expensive in terms of line charges for clubs to take announcers on the road. So they stayed in studio at home. Well, how do you describe a game that you've never seen? And the transmission from the ballpark to the studio provided the missing link. There's a great story. Ronald Reagan, who was then broadcasting at WHO Des Moines, was really the first great practitioner, at least on a fame level, that did recreation. Other broadcasts did. Pat Flanagan, for example, invented them, if you would, with the White Sox and the Cubs. But Reagan made it a national cause celeb. He broadcast for WHO Des Moines in Iowa. And there were 4 stations in Des Moines doing the Cubs game from Wrigley Field. Now, keep in mind that the voices for the other 3 stations were at Wrigley Field. Not so with Reagan. He was getting a recreation, and all he would get would be B10. What does that mean? Ball 1 outside. S2 called. What does that mean? Strike 2 called. and he would then take it from there. It was a theater of the imagination, or as Reagan once told me when I was doing a book, he said, merging fact and fiction. What better training for politics? Well, one day, he's cruising along when Armageddon occurs, and that is the wire ticker broke. So what does he do? He can't say, well, our wire is down. We're now going back to the station for transcribed music. If he does, listeners will turn to the other three stations doing the games live. So inspiration came to the beloved Gipper, and that is that he asked himself, what is the one thing that doesn't get in the box score the next day? Well, the answer came to him as in a vision. Foul balls. You can hit 2 million foul balls and still have 2 strikes. So for the next 8 to 9 minutes, Reagan is having the batter, Augie Galan of the Cubs, foul to the left, foul to the right, foul to Timbuktu, foul out of the ballpark, until finally, at the end of 9 minutes, the wire is restored, and it comes to Reagan, and he starts laughing because it said, batter popped out on first pitch.
That's a great story. I'm wondering how they can figure out if they just got the scorecard itself and they can recreate the game, but it doesn't recreate every single pitch. Did they just make those up?
They did get every single pitch. It came to them by wire, and he got them every, let's say, probably 10 to 12 seconds. So then, today it would be about 30 seconds with the enormous lull between pitches. But then they accented this, for example, with their own pet signatures. For instance, back to Pittsburgh, Rosie Rosewell was the Pirates' voice between 1936 and 1954, and he had sayings which really became household institutions in the tri-state area of western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and West Virginia. For example, Doozy Maroney. What does that mean? It means an extra base hit. Dipsy Doodle meant a strikeout. And he also gave us the most famous home run call of all time, and that is at Forbes Field, home of the Pirates, or by recreation on the road. Yeah. Whenever a Pirate hit a long drive, Rosie Rosewell would say, there's a long drive, the fielder is going back, you can't get it. Open the window, Aunt Minnie, here it comes. So Aunt Minnie was the fictitious character that he invented. And then he would say, he would have next to him an assistant standing on a chair with a pane of glass. And after Rosie said, oh, we can't get it, it's a home run, what would happen then is he would signal to the aide, and the aide would drop a pane of glass on the floor. Well, if you're listening at home, that would signify, oh, it shattered a window.
Right.
And then Rosie would say, oh, that's too bad. Aunt Minnie tripped on her garden hose. She didn't get there again.
Radio by the 1930s and the early 40s, now, unlike those early days, is in many, many homes, millions of homes, in fact.
Right.
And then, of course, if you take KMOX in St. Louis at that time, we kind of referenced this in our conversation before the interview started, that St. Louis was the furthest west and the furthest south baseball team until California baseball.
Yes.
How about the impact of KMOX in the 1930s and early 1940s?
Well, it was enormous. I grew up as a kid in the 1960s listening to Harry Caray and Jack Buck. What a twinning that was. Broadcast the Cardinals, 50,000-watt KMOX, except that it really wasn't limited to the Midwest. It was a national team. And on a clear night in upstate New York, I'd be crouched there with my transistor listening to Harry and Jack, and the station was as clear as if it were next door. So they had an enormous national forum, and they made the most of it. But there were a number of stations that were that strong. WLW in Cincinnati, before regulation, 500,000 watts. WLS in New Orleans, KMOX, WHAM in Rochester, 50,000 watts. People in Colorado used to hear it. Now, that's a national station, and this was true very much with the Cardinals on KMOX. They've had a broadcast litany that probably is second to none. Began with France Laux in the 1920s and 30s. He became a fixture in the World Series of the late 30s. And then, of course, Dizzy Dean, Johnny O'Hara, broadcasting the Cardinals. Bud Blattner later did. And before Kerry and before Buck, and of course, ever since, you've had a Buck in the broadcast booth, in a sense, for the Cardinals. So they were enormously influential and pivotal to the Redbirds becoming Middle America's team. Not simply that, but as you suggest, because St. Louis was the southernmost franchise, the South became Cardinals country. And you would have people trooping up from Mobile, Alabama, and from New Orleans, and from Dallas, Texas, on a weekend at Sportsman's Park, and they'd fill the joint. Bob Bragg, the great late sports editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, said that they would stagger, the Cardinals would, Dizzy Dean's pitching rotation, so he would be sure to pitch on Sunday before a big doubleheader crowd at Sportsman's Park. And that doesn't happen without radio, because it spreads the Cardinals' message, if you would, to an enormous swath of Middle America. And at one time, the Cardinals' radio network numbered almost 130 stations, easily. Then, and to a great extent, still now, the largest network in the game.
There's the stretch. The pitch to Gagliano. Low ball one. How about a base on ball? Now the stretch. The pitch. Ball goes high. The signal given. The stretch. The pitch to Gagliano. Here it is. Ball three. Billy Hands getting ready. Can he throw another bad one? Off the stretch. Here's the pitch on the way. Ball four. Gagliano walks. The Cubs are really arguing. Cepeda dances across the plate. Cha-cha-cha. This game is tied. The stretch. The pitch. Line drive. Up the middle. The Cardinals win. The Cardinals win. The Cardinals win. Look at the Redbirds. Alberto's all over the place. Alex Johnson hit one up the middle. Glenn Beckert got over to get his hands on the ball, but couldn't make a play. And the Cardinals win again. Holy cow!
How does Dizzy Dean, of course, a Hall of Fame player,
Yep.
and very colorful during that time, how does he get into broadcasting? And that's almost like a change
Yeah.
in the way that games were broadcast just in general, to bring a character
Right.
as opposed just a great voice or a great storyteller. Now you got a character involved in the booth.
Yeah. Well, he certainly is one of the most fabled figures in baseball broadcast history. I think the common link between Dean as a player and Dean as a broadcaster was that he was center stage. I mean, wherever he went, he carried center stage. And that was certainly true of Dean broadcasting. He got involved with them when his arm finally gave out after he'd been traded to the Cubs. And in 1941, he said, that's enough of this. And he goes into radio broadcasting with no training of any kind. With Dean, the balls and strikes were totally irrelevant. I'll never forget one incident from the 1960s on CBS. Pee Wee Reese, by then, the great Dodgers shortstop, had become Dean's partner, or Podna, as he called it. He made Podna a national name simply because he would use it so often. And he didn't know anybody's name, but he called them Podna. And they would leave him saying, my God, he remembered my name because he called me Podna. So he was inimitable. With Dean, he didn't, whether a curveball or fastball, or he didn't get into any of that. You were lucky if he even gave you the score. But who cared? I mean, as a kid, I didn't know, for example, that Dean had been a great pitcher with the Gas House Gang in the 1930s and had made the Hall of Fame in 1953 as a pitcher. I only knew that he just made baseball entrancing. For example, he would say, and this is very true, he dropped out of second grade and he said, I wasn't so good in first grade either. And he butchered the English language. A runner's slud. Fielders are now returning to their respectable positions. Or my own favorite, that batter, he's standing confidentially at the plate. He weighed about 300 pounds as he ballooned to his weight late in his playing career. And with he and Pee Wee, it was two good old boys, and they became extended members of the family. And Dean would leave the broadcast booth, and let's say the 6th, 7th inning, and he'd say, Pee Wee. And Pee Wee, yeah, Diz, what? I'm leaving. I'm going to get some food in the concession. Want some? And He said, yeah, hamburger's fine with me. I mean, this kind of back and forth. And then the next picture would be, and this is the twist of the whole plot, he was trying to maneuver his way down this very narrow ladder, if you would, to the deck below, and he got impaled. He got stuck. So the picture is not on the field. The picture is on old Biz, God bless him, and he's trying to extricate himself so he can go get fed. Not that he needed it at this point. But that's how it was. Bill McPhail was the president of CBS television, and he said that in mid-America, watching Dizzy Dean was a religion, phrase I used earlier. He said an absolute religion. In fact, he opposed at the time the great Lindsey Nelson at NBC television, and in 1960, Jack Buck on ABC television. And I remember talking to Lindsey once, and he said that the reason that we went to Sunday, speaking of NBC, as well as Saturday in 1957 was because we wouldn't get any ratings. I mean, Dean just annihilated them. He beat Bob Wolf, he beat Lindsey Nelson, he beat Joe Garagiola, he beat, as I said, Nelson in the Nielsen ratings by outrageous ratios of like 3, 4, and 5 to 1. He was baseball at the time if you lived in a small town.
Come on in, Diz, and tell us all about it. Thank you, Pee-wee, and I can't keep remarking how well you are talking. And so long as you've talked today, I begin to think there for a minute I wasn't even going to get on today. Well, Diz, I had a lot of practice last week. I got to do 6 innings, and 6 innings you did? Oh, yeah, I was a big man last week. I don't see no reason why you shouldn't do 6 today, partner. Joe Montano leads things off up there as we start the ball game. Hunt winds up the first pitch of the ball game with a fastball high for ball 1. Stevie told you a beautiful afternoon for baseball here at Crosley Field in Cincinnati, Ohio. Joe Montano, the second sacker up there with the count of 1 ball and no strikes. Next pitch is high for ball 2, and the count is 2-0. Talking to some of the Cincinnati fans here, boy, they've got pennant fever. Also, some of the executives and the announcers, one of the great ball players, Frank McCormick, who is announcing for the Cincinnati Redlegs, he says, these last few ball games, the Cincinnati Redlegs have thrown away a lot of runs. The opponents in the last 5 games have scored 46 runs against 18 for the Redlegs. There's ball 3 high, and the count is 3-0. Talking to one of the great ball pitchers of all time, Wade Hoyt, who also is broadcasting for the Redlegs. He was talking about some of the trouble that they were having in the last couple of weeks. They lost 5 in a row, and a week ago they were 6 games out in front. Today they find themselves only 2 games out in front of the Los Angeles Dodgers.
Some other great announcers. Mel Allen, the voice of the Yankees, how does he get involved in the duration of his career?
Well, he was born in Johns, Alabama, a little town outside of Birmingham, and he knew that he wanted to go into broadcasting. Radio had really turned him on. He got his law degree from the University of Alabama. He went up to New York City on a lark with some pals of his, and he took an audition. Well, if you ever heard Mel Allen's voice, you would never forget it. It is, I think, without doubt, the most distinctive, most commanding voice in baseball history. And it was everywhere in the 30s, late 30s, and then 40s, 50s, and through the mid-60s. He did the World Series, he did the All-Star Game, he did the newsreels for the sponsor, and for the biggest hits in terms of the newsreels every week that were shown between, let's say, the first and second movies in the theater, you got movie tone newsreels starring your movie tone reporter, Mel Allen. So upwards of 60 to 70 million people heard Mel Allen weekly. This is movie tone, separate and apart from what he did with the New York Yankees. But having taken that audition in 1936-37 in New York, 2 years later he begins with the Yankees. Mel Allen was the voice of the Yankees for the next 25 years, and you couldn't go anywhere in this country without hearing his voice.
In there for a strike, 3-1. So the wear and tear may tell. Black 28, Reynolds 34. The difference in ages may be a factor, it may not. There's a fly ball out to right field. That ball is going, it is gone.
Another great announcer, Ernie Harwell. What's the story of him being traded for a player? And did that ever happen again in baseball history?
Well, it did. This was 1948. Red Barber, the Dodgers announcer, had an ulcer burst, and he was sidelined for the rest of the year. So the Dodgers needed an announcer. And the Atlanta Crackers at that time were an unaffiliated franchise. So Branch Rickey, who owned the Bums, the Dodgers at the time, called Earl Mann in Atlanta, the owner of the Crackers, and said, "We would like to have Barber." Barber had been so good that the Cracker players actually had a radio installed in the dugout, which may be a first and last. So Rickey says, "Well, I'll give you Barber," but he said, "I need a catcher. So I want Brooklyn's second-string catcher, Cliff Dapper." They had Roy Campanella, so they didn't need a number two. So Dapper goes to Atlanta, and Barber goes to Brooklyn, and this began, as I said earlier, Mel Allen with the Yankees, Red Barber with the Dodgers, an interregnum of Harwell particularly as well, but with Barber and Allen. And Ernie Harwell was one of a number of wonderful Southern broadcasters come north. There was Allen, as I said, from Alabama. There was Barber, who was born in Mississippi, then went to Florida for college, and then up north, Lindsey Nelson and Jimmy Dudley. So with the Giants at the time, Russ Hodges from Kentucky. And it was lovely because it was sort of a foreign accent to New York, but it was a very soothing and a very sweet siren kind of a voice, as a Southern voice tends to be, which perfectly coincides with baseball's tempo. And that is sort of leisurely, sort of laid back. And they were a wonderful fit. And they owned the town. They owned New York really for the better part of a quarter century.
If you look at the list of the Ford Frick awardees over time, it seems like the golden age of this, even though television had developed during this time, was the 50s and 60s. And you have all of those great names throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then into modern times as well.
There's no question about it. This is simply not nostalgia talking. You talk to people who broadcast then or broadcast now, and they both agree. The great artists, if you would, who seduced an audience, who could use the game's tempo as a branch then to spring off and talk about. Mel would talk about really anything regarding the Yankees. In fact, someone once said of him that if Mel sold fish, he could make it seem as if Puccini wrote the score. That's how seductive he was. And he could make the infield fly rule as imposing as the Constitution, even if he took twice as long to explain it. But Barbara, with this wonderful gift for language as well, not simply the way he sounded, but the way that he would utilize the English language, which is really such an absolute essential to be a really great announcer. Dean incinerated the language. That's how he used it. Allen elevated the language. That's how he used it. And the same was true of Red Barber. So you had this marvelous coterie of Dixie announcers come north, and they set the tale. I think if you go back, Sporting News every year had a preview issue, and in it they had an entire page devoted to the radio, television voices of the individual clubs, and they had headshots of those announcers. And this really intoxicated me as a kid. Who are these people? Well, I heard them. I know, so I knew who they were. But the voices were so distinctive. They weren't like today's, who are basically automatons and clones and sound-alikes. These people each had a distinct voice, a distinctive way of utilizing English. In memory, they are great. But I've gone back and listened to tape of them back then, and they were just as good. So it's not as if memory is playing tricks. We knew it was good. That's why we love the game, at least in large part.
Those styles are interesting to me as well, because if you take Vin Scully and Jack Buck, these are gentlemanly.
Yeah.
And they have a refinement to them. But then if you juxtapose them with Harry Caray, it makes it fun. They're both acceptable and both beloved, even though they're completely different types of announcers.
No one route to intoxicating an audience. And certainly if you look at Barber, who would talk about the little footsteps of sunshine, or he catches the ball like a baby chick falling from a tree. Scully later had a variation of this as well. But the trick is to know your audience and know yourself. so that your format and your way of broadcasting the game works for you. And it's precisely, Red Barber was very literate, very erudite. He would quote Carlyle and Thoreau in one line, and he would give you a Stan Musial and Roy Campanella in the next. That's variety. And Allen simply, with a great instrument of a voice, I call it that a florist must have decorated his voice, simply had to speak, and you were hooked. Dean was obviously one unto himself, and no one, if you tried to beat Izzy Dean, good luck, you would fail, and some have. But yes, I mean, Buck and Kerry, Jack Buck and Harry Caray for so many years, from the mid-1960s through 1969, they were the Cardinals. And if you're listening to them throughout Middle America, you could imagine having them over, for example, for Thanksgiving dinner, and there'd be no awkwardness or hesitation. They'd come in the front door, and you felt like you knew them, even though you'd never met them. And that only happens in baseball for a number of reasons, chief among them that it's daily sport, and it comes into your living room 162 times a year. So there's an intimacy, if you would, that develops between the audience and the announcer in baseball that is not rivaled by any other sport.
So the winning run is at second base with 2 out, 3-2 to Mookie Wilson. Little roller up along first, behind the bag. It gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it. If one picture is worth 1,000 words, you have seen about 1,000,000 words. But more than that, you have seen an absolutely bizarre finish to Game 6 of the 1986 World Series. The Mets are not only alive, they are well, and they will play the Red Sox in Game 7 tomorrow.
If you take a guy like Harry Caray, for example, I don't know if he could get hired today. I mean, modern announcers have to go to the right school and say the right things and look a certain way, remain impartial, not be too much of a fan. Being a fan is what made Harry Caray so interesting and endearing.
Yeah.
Would you touch on the impact that Kerry had on baseball and why even today he is so beloved?
I would be delighted to, because he at night was, along with Allen and Barber, indeed my introduction to the game. I had a political science teacher of mine in high school, and he would literally go home and put on KMOX, and he was as avid a fan in upstate New York and followed them as closely as anyone in Missouri or Illinois. So yes, Harry Caray, in fact, once said to me that today a young Harry Caray couldn't get a job. Now, how sad a commentary is that on what passes for announcing today? A writer once said of Harry, he said, the greatest show on radio, no ifs, ands, or buts, is to have Harry Caray going nuts. And, I mean, his famous home run call, which probably could be parroted by every home in the Midwest at the time he was broadcasting, it might be, it could be, it is, holy cow. I'll never forget him. This is 1984. I was watching on cable television, Harry by now doing the Cubs. And one night, the Cubs won a game, and they came from behind. And Terry says, and at that point, they looked like they might indeed win their first title of any sort since 1945. And 45 was the pennant. In 1984, it was the National League East. But Harry one night said, holy cow, Cubs win, Cubs win. Good Lord, wants the Cubs to win. Clearly he did, because they won the title. But he was a cable leviathan on WGN's coverage of Wrigley. And this is at a time in the early 80s and mid-80s when cable was really introducing itself to the American public. Imagine what a thrill it was. Night after night after night, cable, television, baseball. My goodness, Harry must have thought that he'd stumbled upon an open bar. It was wonderful. And we were talking before, I'm not sure that you could measure who was the most beloved broadcaster in baseball history. But if you could measure this, I will bet you a Budweiser, which Harry would be very pleased about, that no one ever loved baseball more than Harry Caray. And it was contagious. people felt that on radio or television, and they loved the game in return.
I don't know what the big deal about Cracker Jack is. Did you ever go and buy a pack of Cracker Jack thinking you're going to get a prize and find no prize in the box? Here's the pitch. That might not sound important to some people when you're a little kid, especially from humble origin, and they cheat you out of a prize. There's a bouncing ball. Second baseman has the Barbary over to first. It's hard to think in laudatory terms of the product.
I take it there was an occasional box of Cracker Jacks that found no prizes for the little Harry Caray many years ago.
You got that right. And boy, when a box of Cracker Jack to me meant a lot of money. There's a pitch bounce foul. That's the most asinine marketing I've ever heard of. 1 ball, 1 strike. These guys say, well, you sing about Cracker Jack. I said that I only sing it because it's in the song. Here's a pitch foul back. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised, even to this day, some youngsters who buy a box of Cracker Jack don't find a prize in the box. 1 ball, 2 strikes, 2 out. Well, if you're going to talk about our congressman being crooked, here's a pitch foul out of play. Why not talk about commercial products that don't do what they represent to do?
I remember listening to Harry Caray, and what I would enjoy doing, I was a Cardinal fan. I'll just tell you, when I was a kid, here's generally what I would do. If I got home from school, I could turn on WGN and watch the Cubs and cheer against the Cubs, which was always fun. But this is what I would do. And then if Harry Caray was agonizing over the Cubs getting beaten, which happened on occasion,
right,
I could enjoy that. I really enjoyed that. And then I could watch the Cardinals. And I'll tell you what I would do. I would watch them on TV and then turn on Jack Buck and Mike Shannon and listen to the radio. That's how I watched baseball when I was a kid.
Well, you're multimedia before the term. But that's very true. You know, I'm mentioning Harry being beloved, and he always said, somewhat artfully, because I'm not sure that he believed this, but he always said he referred to himself as an average fan who just happened to have the good fortune to be behind the mic. Well, he knew what he wasn't the average fan, but he had that extroversion, that religious fervor for the game. And that was shared by 2 of the great fandoms in any sport, of course, the Cardinals and then the Cubs. So he just resounded on every possible note that you would want in terms of what a baseball fan loved. And particularly in his early years, I've gone back and listened, and he was as sharp and as incisive and as contemporary as play-by-play as Mel Allen. Later, of course, in life, he lost a lot of that sharpness, particularly after his stroke in the mid-'80s. But you want fun? Harry gave it to you. You can't be fun at the old ballpark. As I said, he didn't say you can't beat statistics. You can't beat the 2-seam fastball. He said you can't be fun. Be fun. And he said once to me, you have to know when the game can speak for itself and when you have to speak for the game. I said, what do you mean exactly? He said, well, a 2-1 game or 9-8 game, the game speaks for itself. If it's 19-1 in the second inning, you more or less have to speak for the game. And he did, night after night after night. I mean, just think of his great commercial for the Cubs in the 1990s, Cub fan Budman. I mean, who else could have done that? Spectacular.
More modern situations. There's a lot of money in baseball today. We were talking about the baseball contracts and these local regional broadcasts. I don't think it's fair to compare baseball to football. Football's always been more of a national sport and more of a modern innovation than baseball. Baseball's always been a regional sport, and that's the way it's captured today. And it's very lucrative, but you don't have the same iconic announcers. What do you think causes that?
Well, when I was growing up, baseball was very much a national sport. It was the national pastime. That's one reason why Dean's ratings were so stupendous, but not his alone. And the World Series, the All-Star Game were sports' 2 highest-rated events. But what baseball did, they sold out. They were like the Oscar Wilde line about they know the price of everything and the value of nothing.
Mm.
And they began to sell their rights and reduce the network coverage. And it had a crippling effect on baseball, particularly if you grew up in areas of the country without local team coverage. But today, it's almost exclusively regional, which is part of this enormous problem, and why announcers have to struggle to keep a game alive. Of course, yesterday the Red Sox played the Indians, I think, and a 10-inning game took 4 hours and 54 minutes. You try to keep an audience awake for that long. So announcers today have a problem in length that the old announcers didn't, where you would have the average game throughout most of the 50s and 60s were, not making this up, about 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's twice the time that I just cited, or half the time. So it requires an even more exciting, exuberant voice, if you would, to keep baseball's attention today. And announcers are not trained to be that way. They actually think that people tune in, are dying to find out the velocity angle of a home run, or care precisely what kind of pitch it is. I mean, so often I'll listen to baseball today when I do listen, and you would think of it as only a pitcher-catcher seminar. There's no story, there's no fun, there's no aside, there's no comedy, just one analytic pitch after another. In fact, the whole science of baseball is today analytics. Analytics ain't fun.
Well, that's definitely not fun, and I still really enjoy baseball, but nationally it has waned and faded from the collective consciousness.
It's almost non-existent on a national level, if not in consciousness, at least on the television. And on radio, again, announcers are not taught to entertain. They're taught to try to stick to the balls and strikes, to the guts of the game. Well, that can turn off even an avid fan, and I guarantee you that it keeps casual fans from even trying the game. So they go elsewhere. They go to games where the games are shorter, or where announcers don't become so obsessed with numbers. Numbers aren't romantic. They're not lyric. They don't appeal to the heart.
The art of baseball is still there, actually.
It is.
Analytics seem to undervalue that art. There are some statistics that are interesting. Velocity can be exciting. The distance of a mammoth home run, that can be fun. But spin rate and launch angles and all of this other information, it's too much for an average fan, let alone a casual fan. But the art's still there. It's just covered up.
It is. And I do think that sometimes I wonder how well the lords of baseball understand the game. My hunch is not very well at all. And if they did, they would work with announcers. I've often said, and I've talked to broadcasters about this, that a broadcast school overseen by the major leagues in terms of trying to re-educate some of the voices today, to make them loosen up, to make them stray from play-by-play, to be entertaining, so that when it's 19-1 in the second inning, you don't automatically turn off, but you wait to see what the announcer says and hears.
The last question I have for you, so based on that conversation, what do you think the future of broadcasting baseball will be like?
This I know. No one today could write a book the way I did with Voices of the Game in the late 80s. That has nothing to do with any talent or lack of talent that I might have, but simply that I had the frame of reference. I had the Deans and Mel Allen and Red Barber and Vin Scully and Lindsey Nelson, and this wonderful panoply of characters. Today, who would they have? Who would they write about? There are very few household names on a network level, almost none, in fact. And locally, they don't approach the game with the same vibrancy and zest. So no one perhaps would be even moved to write a history of the game. And that's sad, because when I was growing up, two things meant something to me outside of my family. And I'm sure many of your listeners will appreciate this because they probably feel the same. One was America. I was growing up thought to be an American, not a member of some self-identified special interest group. And the second was baseball. I remember talking to Bob Costas, and I've done this with other announcers, and our answer is always the same. I asked Bob once, what does baseball mean to you? And he said, and I said at the same time, everything. It meant everything. If you were a kid growing up in 1950s or early 60s America, not to mention the America before, So I think baseball has to look in the mirror and ask itself, what is it that makes baseball so special, such an heirloom of the heart for so many years for America? If they do that, there's hope for the game. Otherwise, not much.
Do you think there's any chance a guy like Mike Shannon, a character like that, will ever get the Ford Frick Award or be inducted in the Hall in that way as an announcer?
I'm not sure. You know, he has a rough-hewn style, and that's similar to a number of broadcasters. They're certainly won't mistake Mike Shannon for someone else, and in that sense, it's very good. He doesn't have the same sense of humor and comedy that Dean did. He obviously knows baseball. I'm not sure. I wouldn't purport to speak for any of my colleagues. I'm a member of the Ford Frick voting committee. But we go through this. We're restricted, and this, Rob, really is unfortunate, to only one broadcaster a year.
Right, yeah.
That we can induct with a Frick. And that penalizes fine broadcasters, Mike Shannon, Jim Woods, who used to broadcast for the Cardinals, as well as the Pirates, Ned Martin of the Red Sox. A writer once called him the Vin Scully of the American League. You can't get much more praiseworthy than that. But they'll never get in the Hall, not only if we have one a year. And I think that's a shame. So that's the change that I would make if someone asked me, which they have not, indeed.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Rob. I have too.
I would like to thank my guest today, renowned baseball writer and analyst, Curt Smith. And if you would like to get his book, Memories from the Microphone, A Century of Baseball Broadcasting, simply click on the link in the description below. And you're definitely going to want to pick up this book. It's an official book of the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Our featured brew was Batting 1000 Red Lager from the Beltway Brewing Company of Sterling, Virginia. And I'd like to remind you again to subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. All of the directories have an easy-to-use sharing function. For more information on shows and authors, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page, and you can check out our YouTube channel as well. The music was provided by the tremendous North Carolina band Bones Fork, and we are just days away from the release of their new album. And finally, I'd like to thank the growing list of listeners and supporters from 2,000 cities from around the world. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Freeze leading it off. Crowd in a frenzy. 3-2, a swing and a high fly ball. Center field. It is gone! David Freeze, who tied it in the 9th, wins it in the 11th. In one of the most remarkable, improbable baseball games you will ever see. And there's going to be baseball here in St. Louis, Game 7 tomorrow night.